Hey guys, I'm learning TFT and I'm sharing my learnings with you so that you can learn and I can learn better as well. In this video, I'm going to go over set 16 early game unit tiers using Ripple Overdrive's framework. I recently posted a video by Ripple where he had a presentation on evaluating early game unit strength. Seems like it's been pretty popular so far, and I would recommend you check that out if you want to understand the theory and the framework behind what this analysis will be. But basically, I'm going to put Ripple Overdrive's framework into practice and share with you a breakdown of some spreadsheet analysis I did based off of many of the variables that Ripple talks about in his video. And the inspiration behind this video is from Hi, it's Mizu, a comment he asked, or they asked, have you done any exercises or offline work after this session to practice these concepts or ideas? Basically, how to apply these ideas. And so I thought, what better way than to try to go through the raw data of PBE and try to apply these to come up with a tier list. Specifically, what this analysis is attempting to do is to come up with strongest board analysis and or being able to generate econ slash resources, for example, Bard, Extol, Bilgewater. It does not assess units that have permanent scaling power. The purpose of this analysis is to figure out basically how to win streak stage 2 or generate as many resources as possible. When you win streak, you can generate more gold. If you put in resource generating traits, then you can also generate more gold or other resources. This analysis also does not assess what lines the units lead down towards what meta comps. My goal here is to come up with an abstracted framework, at least for the current state of PBE, to figure out what are the strong units. And so based off of what live patch adjustments here, I might be able to do an updated analysis, but you can kind of adjust the tiers accordingly based off of what gets stronger or weaker. And the high level categories that I have here is understanding starting mana and total mana for the unit. And specifically, a key idea that Ripple talks about is trying to somewhat standardize or normalize the mana ability rotations, is what he calls them. So, for example, for someone that has 30 mana, like Sona, I would basically multiply the ability impact times 3 for 90 mana, and compare it to someone like, let's say, Zoe, who would basically have 2 casts in the same time that Sona would have 3 casts. And that way we can normalize by the way, all of this analysis is assuming 2 stars. So a 2-star Zoe versus a 2-star Sona, for example. And this gives us a general idea of the overall strength of these units when compared to one another at the same cost tier. Of course, I didn't actually include like Zoe 1 versus Sona 2 here, but you could do a similar analysis. Additionally, I included basically offensive 90 mana value, defensive 90 mana value, positional variance, like how much the unit being effective is impacted by optimal versus suboptimal positioning. For example, Kiana does damage across multi-hex range, and it's highly positional dependent. Also, how reliant a unit is on a very strong frontline, like Viego is a stacking unit and melee, so having a very strong frontline makes a very big difference in Viego's damage output. And then how flexible the unit is when it comes to itemization. And that also kind of leads into how flexible that item is later in the game if you were using that unit as an item holder. So if usually that means like melee champions like Kiana will have low item flexibility since they'll oftentimes want healing, whereas someone like Sona you could slam blue buff or Shojin and that could still flex between AD or AP. I don't know why I have Jin here. That should be low. The last column is damage consistency. So we have whether someone's consistent damage, like regular, so like a Ashe from set 15 would be a very consistent damage dealer because their output is very regular, versus someone that may have a low damage output. Then Spike would be a very bursty champion. Bursty champions will typically tend to have more kind of like higher mana pools and could also result in overkill damage being wasted. So consistent damage champions are usually going to be more reliable. And then I have a notes category here. So that's the game plan for this video. I'm going to go through each of the units from 1 cost, 2 cost, and 3 cost. I'll include a link to this spreadsheet as well in the description below. I did do the analysis for 4 and 5 costs as well, but for the purposes of this video, I wanted to kind of tier the units in at 1, 2, and 3 costs for specifically stage 2, since it's easier to kind of compare them. Plus, once you get to 4 and 5 costs, there's a lot more other variables that come into play, especially AoE, that becomes a lot harder to calculate, whereas AoE is far less common in the first 1, 2, and 3 cost range. So that's the game plan for this video. I'm going to put up the unit that we're going to talk about and then go through each unit. And then I have tier list in a visual format that we can kind of review after we get through this analysis. So we'll start off with Viego. He's a fighter. I have him ranked tier A here. Actually, technically, I think I had him at B, mainly because his passive gains AS with Shadow Isles, Soul stacks, which means that early game he's going to be a little bit weaker. On top of that, he gains stacking magic damage, which usually he'll be stronger if you have a fully itemized 2-star Viego plus a fully itemized 2-star tank, which you usually don't have in the beginning. So I suspect that he'll oftentimes, when you do play him, will pop off more so in like 3-1 to 3-2-ish when you have more items and you can 3-star him. So yeah, I have him at B tier here. One thing to keep in mind, by the way, I have not played much PvE, and I did this analysis independently of looking at like meta TFT's unit stats. So I am also curious if you've experienced different results on seeing how these units operate in the early game. I would definitely love to hear your thoughts in the comments. But this, I think, should be close approximation. One thing also is like the unit stats show end game results of which early like 1, 2, and 3 cost units fit into end game boards. So they're not a proper representation of the strength in stage 2, which is why I want to do this analysis independently. So that's just something to keep in mind. I've played like less than 15 games of PvE so far. All right, so Sona does 180 magic damage to 2 nearby enemies and restores health. So that's a lot of overall output, which I think is amongst the highest, aside from maybe Kiana at the 1 cost level. If Kiana does not have good positioning, it's highly dependent there. And she has very consistent damage output because her mana cost is so low. So it'll be kind of regularly dealing output. So I have Sona at S tier. Item flex because Sona could basically, anyone that could do blue buff or Shojin becomes more flexible for later in the game. And low positional variance and low requirement for very strong frontline because of the low mana rotations. Ripple called it ability rotations, where the longer the mana, the like higher variance, because you could have your unit killed off before they're able to cast. And so having lower mana basically decreases the variance on that unit. Shen has a 650 shield which is the highest shield out of all the 1 costs here. And one thing to keep in mind is that the 4-second shield may be wasted. So ideally, you probably want to consider solo frontlining a 2-star Shen so that when Shen does cast, the shield is consumed by the enemy main carry instead of wasted. Rumble deals, so the overall kind of like output of the mana amount is roughly similar and maybe even higher for Rumble, but Rumble deals more of it in damage, and Rumble does a burst of flames in a cone, so it's dependent on whether the enemy is clumped or not, whether they have a solo front line like Stoneplate. So this is going to be more variable, and that's why I have Rumble as a medium positional variance. Kiana dashes to a nearby hex and then deals physical damage in a 2-hex line. So if she is hitting 2 units, her damage output will actually be the highest. But that's, again, highly positional variance, and then also dependent on having a good front line. One thing when you think about melee carries is even though they usually have a higher DPS, if your main tank dies first, they're usually targeted next. So oftentimes they'll deal less damage in a fight than a backline carry with lower DPS, just because they die earlier in the fight and have less time to deal that damage output. Kiana also has low item flexibility because she'll usually want melee carry items, which is far less flexible, which is why I have her at A tier here. Lulu, just quite bad. Lulu seems to be more of a support unit. I don't know. I haven't actually seen what it means to make them dance for 2 seconds. Is that like a disable or something? So I suppose I would consider bumping up Lulu to like a B tier, perhaps, if that's kind of like a equivalent of a stun. But like the damage output here is basically half of what we have here. And by the way, I did this as kind of an offset of 90. So like to get 2 casts off, this would be 50 plus another 70, 120. So 120 mana rotation. So that's just something to keep in mind when you look at this. And this analysis is not perfect for that reason, but just makes it a lot easier to compare. Kog'Maw has some positional variance because of adjacent enemies are dealt 50% of the damage in effect. So it can actually be quite high if the enemy, for example, you're hitting a center unit and then they have 2 units that are adjacent, then you can be getting up to 1200 damage here, which is about the same output as Sona, but it's highly positional dependent, and Kog'Maw's items are a little bit less flexible, or medium flexibility here. Yeah, very, very positionally dependent. And then if you're hitting only 1 unit, the damage output is actually not that high if it's at 600. Jhin, reasonable damage output. Oh, another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of this analysis does not include trait benefits. So like this does not include gunslinger value of like how much his AD would go up. So you would expect this to be a little bit higher, which, ideally I could update this analysis to include all of that, but I just want to simplify it more. So he seems to be reasonable here. Item wise, he does want like a Rageblade Kraken setup, which means that his item flexibility is quite low. So I would even consider making him like B tier as a result of that. But with Gunslinger, this damage output goes up. So I'd say somewhere around A. Jarvan gives your team attack speed, which shield wise, his shield isn't that great, but also boosts your attack speed for your main carry. And he can unlock Silas later if you sell a 2-star Jarvan. I know I mentioned I didn't really want to include what lines the unit leans towards, but I guess for purposes of unlocking, I just wanted to mention that here. Alawi restores health and then deals damage in a line. So this line damage could be non-trivial. Usually though, with tanks, you kind of care more about their shielding than about their damage. But yeah, like the overall output here is like not bad. Also, bruisers tend to, because of the flat HP in the early game, is more valuable. So that's another reason Shen especially is particularly good. I know I mentioned I'm not really trying to include analysis on traits here, so that's just something to keep in mind. Caitlyn, pretty standard Caitlyn compared to past sets. Highly positional variance. This damage with long shot would be much higher. And basically, if you can get a good line of attack towards the enemy carry and you one-shot them, then you win the fight. So you could argue that this is S, but it's highly positionally dependent and requires some mana gen to be able to cast earlier and then maybe even like a damage item to be able to actually one-shot them, like an IE. So there's a number of conditions that have to go right for Caitlyn to pop off, but when she does, she can definitely be S tier. So, but because you can't always guarantee those conditions, I have her as A tier here. Briar, by the way, for units that don't have anything here, they tend to be more auto attack based, and it's kind of hard. Same with Viego here. It's like harder for me to actually value them. This Briar here, I mainly put S because of some of the limited experience I have with Briar in PvE, which is that it's highly dependent on a strong frontline, but Briar's DPS, when Briar does pop off, it seems to be quite high, and you can happen to jump to like a enemy carry and take them out. So, but again, it's low item flexibility and highly dependent on having a good tank. So I would say has strong potential, but I could see an argument for like a tier over here. Blitzcrank has solid shield value here, higher than both Rumble and Lowy. Similar to Jarvan, but then also does some non-trivial amount of damage depending on if people are going to surround him or not. So having like a stone plate, especially if the other team has 2 or 3 melee units, like let's say they have a Kiana and just all frontline, then Blitz can actually do a lot of damage. So possibly quite solid unit there. Anivia, damage output lower than Sona, but if the enemy unit is chilled, then the damage can critically strike, which can make a big difference. And so, but that basically means there's more conditions that need to be met for Anivia's optimal situation to be met. All right, so Viego or Yorick, 2 costs. So Yorick, we have one thing to keep in mind is that it takes some time to unlock Yorick, but Yorick does have a debuff on enemy carry that dealt the most damage in the fight, which both chills and raises the mana of their next cost, which is quite strong. And has a 370 defensive output and solid damage output as well. So overall, I put Yorick as an A tier here. I could definitely see against certain setups, because I haven't really played much Yorick. I could see that maybe this utility could bump Yorick in early game into S tier. I'm not exactly sure about that. Yasuo is Deals damage to adjacent enemies. So this damage is actually quite variable. I should update this to medium. And melee fighters in general just rely on strong front lines and low item flexibility. So this overall damage here, like even if you compare it to Anivia, which was not even a great one cost, the damage output is not great. And a lot of it also depends. Like it seems like for Yasuo to really get maximum damage output, um, it relies on playing Yasuo 3 with Yone, and you're just not going to get that in the early game. And so this analysis is really around early game. So Yasuo seems somewhat weak in the early game. Xin Zhao, it's really hard in the early game, like stage 2, to be able to play his traits, especially since wardens are hard to come by. He's the only 2-cost warden that is by default available. And on top of that, his shield is lower than some of these 1-cost tanks, especially if you even compare it with Shen. So let me actually make sure I got Shen. $60 plus. Oh, I did not get Shen right. Oh, and a nearby downline ally. Yeah. Okay, no, I did get that right. So where was I? Okay, Yasuo. All right, Xin Zhao, Vi. Okay, Xin Zhao also deals a variable damage output, but again, like usually you're not really looking for your tanks to deal that much damage. You care more about them just tanking. So yeah, I had Xin Zhao at B. Vi is actually a melee unit, and Vi has a lot of shield, actually more shield value than both Xin Zhao and York, and is a defender. Piltover is a 2 trait and Defender is a 2 trait, so traits are fairly easy to activate. And the damage that Vi deals is actually quite a lot. And then every third cast deals damage in a 2 hex range and knocks up, so there's utility value there. Does rely a little bit more on frontline because she's melee, less item flexibility, positional variance, because some of her abilities deal damage to 1 hex range and 2 hex range, but gonna have more consistent damage output because of the 30 mana cost here. But if we just look at this total kind of rough damage output, it's really damage and defensive. For the mana cost that she's getting, it's really high compared to everything else. So I have her at S tier. TF, auto attacking champion, hard for me to really kind of put numbers to here. But since TF and Graves seem to synergize with each other, and it's kind of hard to unlock Graves immediately, and TF is more of a Rage Blade user because basically every third attack he throws 3 cards, so he wants to attack more, which is low item flexibility, relies on a strong frontline for the Rage Blade to really start taking effect, and you need Graves, so it's just a lot of conditions to make TF successful. Getting Bilge open does give econ, but it seems like this, and the cards also depend on, like, have heavy positional variance. So it just seems to me that there are a lot of conditions that are required to make TF successful, which if you can get them to work, it seems like TF could be more like A tier. But I just kind of default him there. Tryndamere, the offensive output seems pretty poor and highly dependent on getting the permanent stacks when Ashe or Tryndamere get kills. So similar to Viego, like any stacking champions by default in the early game will probably be weak. So I have Tryndamere C. Again, for the purposes of this analysis, it's more about like what units will help you win streak and or generate reliable resources. And I'm not really doing this analysis on which champions are best at scaling. So that's not to say that Tryndamere Ashe can't be good. I kind of, I haven't really seen anybody talk about it in PBE right now, but maybe that's buffed and this could still be lower than some of the other ones, but it could become meta, right? And so that's for the purposes of this exercise, I'm not really accounting for that. Tristana, damage output 840 here. It's like kind of even like in the gym ballpark for a 2 cost. Doesn't seem that strong. Yeah. Yeah, it just doesn't, seems a little bit undertuned. Teemo is a damage over time champion, so heavily reliant on having a strong front line. It's an 8-second poison, so it does rely on having that strong front line. But if you can get the 8 seconds off, Teemo by far deals a lot more damage than everybody else at the 2 cost tier. Now you can kind of argue that some of this damage will be wasted, but even if you take like 2/3 of this, this is still in the ballpark of over 1,000 damage. So yeah, Teemo seems to be quite strong. Scion, the shield value is quite low. Damage isn't even that high. Likely again, because Scion is a permanent max health scaling champion, the Scion in stage 2 likely will not be that strong. Next we have Rek'Sai. Definitely has potential for sniping the back line unit, so position variance is high. Melee champion relies heavily on strong frontline. Item flexibility low because it's a melee champion. So I have Rek'Sai as a B tier here, but mana cost is low, so it definitely does consistent damage output. But because he's like kind of dashing back and forth, could just end up leaving a bunch of champions at low HP. So consistency wise, I would say likely not that consistent. Poppy does require an unlock, Demacian or Yordle with 2 items equipped. Shield value is actually very good. Strongest, it seems, out of all of the 2 costs. Yeah, strongest shield value. And has a 120 mana rotation, so 40 mana to get to the first cast, another 80 to get to second cast. So yeah, like this output could be even higher here. So yeah, quite strong. And then Juggernaut and Yordle both like traits are 2 pieces that can easily be activated to strengthen her further. Orianna is a burst champion, 100 mana rotation. So I basically just assumed for some of these champions, I assumed that they get 2 casts off like this one, and does do damage in a 1 hex circle, so somewhat dependent on positional upside on the damage, but quite solid. I have her at A tier here. Nico, I've played around Nico a few times in PBE, and I've been very surprised at the amount of damage output that she has. On top of that, she has a decent sized shield, second at 2 costs level to Poppy, and does a lot of AoE damage. Plus has chill, so it's actually quite good with Anivia, for example. So I have Nico at S tier. Plus she's an Ixtal, so if you get Emilio early, like you can generate resources that way. Graves, similar to TF, when you do get them both in, they do synergize well, but Graves's like kind of damage output seems very low at 300. Gunslinger should buff this up a little bit, but I suspect that a lot of the Graves and TF spikes is when you hit 3-star. And Bilgewater makes it pretty easy to hit 2 stars, so I suspect that that's part of the reason that the 2-star damage output is so low. Echo is 924, which is actually quite strong, but is a melee champion. So like, for example, with Oriana, you'd probably prefer this 960 over this 924. Yeah, so like Echo seems quite solid. It's just you have high reliance on a strong front line, and then there's positional variance as well because there's a zone where the amount of damage that the target takes in that zone deals more 10% of the target's damage taken during the duration to all enemies in the zone. So definitely a positional dependent unit for Echo. Cho, a low shield amount, so you probably should not really expect Cho to tank early game. Similar to Sion, like they would tank less than some of these one costs like Shen or Jarvan, even like Alawi Blitz. But Cho has a lot of utility. Deals damage in 2 hex and also knocks up for 1.5 seconds. So it deals decent damage and utility. So I have Cho at A tier here. Plus, both of his traits are 2 pieces, which should make it easier for him to activate them. Bard has quite strong 960 off of the 90 mana for damage, and also generates econ for you in the form of free reroll or a unit each round. So yeah, quite solid unit in the early game. So I have Bard at S tier here. Of course, Bard does require 4 rerolls before stage 2 carousel, so it's kind of hard to unlock him in most cases unless you have like a good augment setup to facilitate that. Ash, very low damage output, extremely bad. But again, more of an attack speed, auto attack unit, so kind of hard to measure. But similar to Tryndamere, I expect Ash to be low, like kind of damage output early game because basically both Tryndamere and Ash get scaling, permanent scaling as they get kills over time. So yeah, overall it's going to be not that strong in the early game. And then Aphelios is auto attack champion. Hard to measure. I just put him at A tier because Targon units should be stronger without Trayton. So yeah, I'm not too sure about this assessment. I just figured A is a reasonable place to put him. All right, 3 costs. Zoe. Zoe's actually the example that Ripple used in his presentation of a particularly strong standalone unit. 1800 damage off of that, and perfect like kind of 90 mana rotation where you get 30 for the first cast, 60 for the second cast, and yeah, just huge amount of damage. You have built-in shred, even chills. Just overall like great utility, great damage output. And so early game Zoe will basically be the golden standard, at least in its current state, for damage output. Vayne, auto attacking champion, pretty reliant on getting like, yeah, just very, I believe is a Rage Blade Kraken user, low item flexibility, which means that it's going to be more reliant on having a strong front line, and this damage output doesn't seem that strong. Although I guess if Vayne's AD were increased, like we would not see Vayne's strength reflected here, so I guess I could be wrong about this. Sejuani, 525 shield, which is solid. Deals damage output and then 120 mana rotation, so this should actually be somewhat higher than this. So reasonable tank value. Like even though these shields are similar, to get to second cast for Nautilus would be 180 mana versus 120 mana. So Sejuani likely a better stage 2 tank. Although Nautilus gives you bilge and has both Juggernaut and Warden, but it's going to be harder to activate all of those at level 4. So I have both of them at A tier because they have solid shields, and then Nautilus particularly because that really helps you get bilge water, which gives you econ early game, even if you don't want to stay in it. Milio 12-15 damage, does do damage in a 1 hex radius, so somewhat positional variance, and does give you Ixtal, so I put Milio at S for that reason. Without Ixtal, I'll probably be closer to A tier. Malzahar, I have seen stuff on like top players talking about Malzahar being like an item holder for Singed. The damage output is very high. It is similar to Teemo in the sense that these voidlings need time to attack the enemy 10 times, so it doesn't occur right away, which means you need a strong frontline for that damage output to actually come to realization. So pure damage output is going to be a little bit lower than Zoe for that reason. Zoe's like burst will happen all at once, but very strong damage output. Is heavily reliant on frontline, and yeah. Loris is actually an example of another unit that Ripple used in his presentation because of this super high 800 shield value. He's basically saying you could play Loris as like a threat unit that has no traits in, and put him like kind of on the side of the enemy carry. And if you can get this 800 shield to proc, that's just huge value. Yeah, like, and then even just the total of this, like 1100-ish for 70 mana, is very, very good value. One key thing is you want to make sure you don't waste this 800 shield. So again, you definitely want Loris to be taking most of the damage when his spell triggers, which sometimes means you might even want to just solo frontline it. Leona doesn't really have much, actually does not have a shield or healing, but does have utility in burn wound and has stun, plus reduces instances of incoming damage, which is particularly useful in the early game in stage 2 when most of the damage dealt is going to be by auto attacks. And so the early game value for Leona is going to be quite strong, but then falls off like closer to stage 4, falls off when a lot of casters start getting like 3 items, AP bursts that can take her down because she doesn't have any sustainability. So this kind of indicates to me that you may want to itemize Leona early, but then move items off towards the middle end of stage 3, definitely by stage 4. All right, LeBlanc. Overall, the offensive output at 90 mana is not very good. Is a burst champion and has some stun value, but does not seem that strong here. Kobuko and Yumi, the mana output here is not very productive, but the passive is quite strong. And so I put Kobuko and Yumi at A tier here. Just make sure to try to keep them safe so that the healing and AS buffs can apply. But Kobuko and Yumi should not be a main tank because there's not much value in the spell. Kennen, on the other hand, has very high mana value on both the offensive and defensive sides. There is quite a good amount of positional variance in that the first 3 targets to be struck by bolts are stunned. So you definitely want to put Kennen in front of any enemy melee carries. And this 700 shield is also quite strong too. Very close to Loris's shield amount. So just overall, very good damage, very good utility. I put Kennen at S tier here. Jinx, I put at B tier as auto attack. Her damage output really doesn't come into play until she gets to switches her weapon to Fishbones at 18 attacks, which heavily relies on like a Rage Blade Kraken setup to maximize her damage output, which is very low item flexibility, highly dependent on a strong frontline, which for the most part in the early game, you're not going to be able to get like, a 2-star frontliner with like a Rage Blade or Kraken setup and have like a decent tank item. So Jinx early game does not seem like would be that strong. Gwen's damage output's quite reasonably strong at 1245 for the 90 mana. But it's because she's melee is heavily reliant on a stronger frontline. Item flexibility is going to be lower. I put medium because she could hold like JG or like AP items. And she does damage in a cone, so her positional variance is medium as well. So I put her at A there. Gangplank, I put at S because he's a Bilgewater. His damage output's reasonably high. Is melee, so and deals damage in a cone, so there's positional variance and dependent on frontline. But overall, like seems like a reasonably strong unit and with the ability to generate resources through Bilgewater. Draven is a low item flexibility unit, relies on Rage Blade, Kraken as well, similar to Jinx. But at the very least, compared to Jinx, Draven can generate you gold. Every 11 adoration stacks can generate you a certain amount of gold, which is quite good in the early game. So even though his damage output doesn't seem like it's going to be that crazy, at least gives you gold. So I put Draven at A tier. Mundo has quite good healing and not shielding. So one thing to keep in mind for healing is you do want Mundo to take damage before his ability triggers. Otherwise, he's just not going to, this 885 is just wasted. And so there's some pros and cons between healing versus shielding for that reason. But he actually deals decent damage too. So I put Mundo at S tier because the combined value here is quite high, similar to Kennen, a little bit less than Kennen, but quite strong. Darius, overall, the sum of these is quite low, 700-ish, 600-ish. I think a lot of the Darius's value will be in executing enemies that likely Draven is dealing the main damage for. So highly positional dependent to be able to get those executes off and dependent on a strong front line. Also, he has an AoE spin. So there just seems to be so many conditions that are required for Darius to really be effective that I put him at B tier. And then Ari is 30 mana, very consistent units or consistent damage. Every third cast splits more of a burst damage. And yeah, like 1375, quite solid. I put at A tier. Like if you compare to Gwen, you would much rather have Gwen, or sorry, you'd much rather have Ari because she's a backliner. And yeah, not too far off from like Zoe, for example. But yeah, I just put one tier lower. So that's all of the units, and then I put a visual tier list together here. So at one cost, we have Shen, Sona, and Briar. Briar's like kind of more dependent on frontline, but Shen and Sona seem to be quite reliable. Shen probably want to frontline with another units because a lot of Shen's value is in shielding both himself and another unit. And so I guess part of that shield could be wasted. And then at the 2-cost level, there's a lot more S tier units. Vi really is the standout. Bard gives you econ and very strong damage. Teemo gives you damage over time. Nico, very strong combo, kind of like Vi. And then Poppy gives you the most shield value. And then at the 3 cost S level, we have Zoe, like we talked about, Malzahar. These two deal the most damage. This needs more of a frontline for Malzahar. Emilio gives you Ixtal and decent damage output. Gangplank gives you Bilgewater and decent damage output. And then these 3, Loris, Kennen, and Mundo, both have very strong shields. And both Kennen and Mundo deal decent damage as well. So that is my analysis breaking down early game stage 2 unit strength based off of Ripple Overdrive's framework. I hope you found this helpful. I would love to hear your thoughts if you had had different experiences on what the early game unit strengths are. Of course, all of this is subject to change based off of what units are buffed or nerfed in the live patch, but I think this hopefully gives us a general framework for how to approach these units and how to think about their mana rotations, what makes them strong, what makes them weak, how consistent these units are, and gives us a better approach in thinking about how to build strongest board in stage 2. So with that said, I do want to also give a shout out that we are accepting applications to TFT Dojo, the community and product site that Virtual and I are working on to help make it easier for you to, I don't want to show this yet, but to be able to, do training exercises for getting better at TFT with a community of learners. And that's available at tftdojo.com. I'll include a link in the description below as well. We are currently in the alpha testing phase, and I'll kind of keep updates on the progress of that. But you can apply right now, and earlier applications will get first dibs on access. So the earlier you apply, the better odds you have of getting in. So with that said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.